Hey everyone, it's me again. This time I'd like to comment on the famed neurosurgeon Dr. Ben Carson's controversial recent remarks about homosexuality, or rather the latest in a string of controversial remarks that he's made ever since he started dabbling in politics. This time, of course, he suggested that prison stays have a way of turning a lot of straight prison inmates gay, and that is somehow evidence that homosexuality is a choice rather than an innate biological condition over which people have no control. Now, I'm not going to delve into the substance of his remarks really at all. A lot of people far more qualified than I am have already done so and picked apart his remarks and proven them wrong. But I'd like to talk about the ramifications of his, I think, mistaken view on this subject for the larger issue of gay rights. And this is an area where I actually disagree with a lot of other people who support gay rights, as well as with people who oppose them. There is this idea among many supporters of gay rights that it doesn't really matter whether or not sexuality or sexual orientation specifically is a choice or not. It doesn't really matter either way, because society has no business, particularly when it comes to the issue of same-sex marriage specifically, society has no business telling people how to live in this area. And so even if homosexuality is a choice, so what, goes the argument. Even if it is, the government still shouldn't discriminate against same-sex couples. I actually think that view is mistaken. I think the strongest case in favor of same-sex marriage takes into account, in fact, is based on the premise that sexual orientation is not a choice, that it's a personal characteristic, a biological and innate characteristic, and an immutable one, meaning it can't be changed, over which people have no control. I think that's important. I think it's important because, first of all, you have to consider the nature of the issue of marriage equality. This is something I've commented on already. I think it was in my second video from last fall. Like I mentioned in that video, the same-sex marriage issue is not fundamentally about personal freedom. That misunderstands or misconceives the nature of the institution of legal marriage. When we talk about trying to end discrimination against same-sex couples in this area, it's not as if we're saying that there's a certain form of conduct that the government is currently prohibiting people from engaging in. Okay, we're not having a debate about so-called anti-sodomy laws here. The Supreme Court already settled that issue, at least in his country, back in 2003 in its decision in the case of Lawrence versus Texas, when it struck down so-called anti-sodomy laws, or laws against laws against anal intercourse anyway, as unconstitutional. Now that's still a live issue in a lot of other societies around the world, sadly, but it's no longer a live issue here in the United States or in Canada, or I think most, if not all, Western industrialized democracies, thankfully. So it's not an issue of the government coming in and telling people you are no longer allowed to do X, Y, Z. It's a question of whether the government is going to extend the same set of legal benefits and privileges to same-sex couples that it already offers to opposite-sex couples. In other words, the marriage equality issue is fundamentally about how the government treats people and whether it's going to treat people who are similarly situated, as the Supreme Court has said, in the same way. That's what the whole certainly the legal and constitutional dimension to the marriage equality issue is all about. That it's all about this principle of the equal protection of the laws. It's all about ending discrimination. But the key is that it's about ending discrimination in the way the government treats people and in what the government gives to people, not discrimination in an area of personal liberty that involves a government prohibition. When the government you often hear people talk about bans on same-sex marriage in a lot of states. That's actually not really accurate terminology. The government isn't really banning anything. What it's really doing is saying we are refusing to extend legal recognition to same-sex unions. We are refusing to grant them marriage licenses and all the legal benefits that come with that. So when you understand that that's how the institution of legal marriage works, and that is sort of the crux of this issue, then you have to look at the whole question of, sexual orientation and whether it's a choice or not differently. This is where that comes into play. If homosexuality were a choice, if people, same-sex couples who are agitating for, the recognition of state governments and the licensing of their marriages, if they had simply woken up one day and decided on a lark that, you know what, I think I'm gonna, stick to my own gender from now on, then I think that would really take the punch out of the case for marriage equality. The reason is that when the government says, no, we're not going to give you a marriage license, it would no longer be discriminating against people based on an innate characteristic similar in many respects, though not all respects, to race or gender. A personal characteristic that people did not choose and cannot change, and that's not inherently harmful to anyone. That whole factor of invidious discrimination, as it's often called, discriminating against people for really the worst reason possible, would no longer be an issue. Rather, you would basically, if homosexuality were a choice, then the decision to enter into a same-sex marriage would simply be a lifestyle choice. It wouldn't be something that's really fundamental to, the lives and the identities of that same-sex couple. Those two people who want to spend the rest of their lives together, they would have chosen to do so, even if they didn't choose to do so lightly. At the end of the day, it would have been something that they simply decided to do, and given that it's a choice, it wouldn't be as compelling for people to say, well, the government has to recognize your lifestyle choice. There would be, it would then be a debate over whether the government should give its seal of approval to all the various lifestyle choices that people might have out there. And that really would not be as compelling a policy. I should say, let me rephrase that. The case for that policy, for that recognition, extending recognition to those same-sex unions, would not be as strong or as compelling. Because, same-sex marriage would just be one more lifestyle choice among many that people could choose. And then the question would be, why should, the government have to extend benefits, legal benefits and recognition to this particular lifestyle choice, and spend lots of taxpayers' money on it to boot? Especially given that so many people in society hold strongly held religious beliefs that tell them that this particular lifestyle choice is wrong, morally wrong. Why should the government have to do that? Why should it be obligated in any way, constitutionally, morally, or otherwise, to recognize those unions? It's just a lifestyle choice. What's the big deal? I mean, if you want to make that choice and live your life that way, playing house with a member of the same sex for the rest of your life, then go ahead and do it, but why should taxpayers have to spend money on it? What's the big deal? I mean, sure, the government would have the option of extending legal recognition to your marriage, but why would it be a moral or legal duty for the government to do that? I think that the whole element of, if homosexuality were just a choice, that whole element of invidious discrimination would no longer be an issue. And then, that would take, I think, the fire out of the whole case for marriage equality. Again, it would be just another lifestyle choice that the government could choose to recognize, but that I don't think the government would then be obligated to recognize. What's more, one of the major arguments that opponents of marriage equality like to make against it is that, if we recognize same-sex marriages today, tomorrow we'll have to recognize polygamous marriages, next week we'll have to recognize incestuous marriages, and before long people will want to marry their dogs. Now, I think there are fundamental differences between homosexuality and polygamy, incest, and bestiality, which are the three other major deviations from the nuclear family that, we often hear about in this debate. But I think the major distinction between sexual orientation, or homosexuality specifically, and those other forms of sexuality, I think the major distinction is that it's not an inherently harmful way to live or a way to, engage in sexual relations and romantic relations, and it's not something that people can choose. Now, people choose to enter into polygamous relationships. They can choose whether to enter into, whether they're attracted. I should say, people can choose to enter into polygamous relationships. They're not driven to do so by some innate biological orientation. Now, I've heard some people argue, well, there's a proclivity among human beings to engage in, sexual promiscuity, but there isn't a proclivity necessarily to have, as far as I know at least, I don't think science has discovered an innate biological proclivity to have lots of different partners at the same time for life, which is what polygamy ostensibly represents. You marry more than one partner for life, till death do you part. I've never heard of a innate biological predisposition that drives people to have those kinds of relationships in the same way that homosexuality drives people to, be in relationships with members of their own sex in order to have fulfilling, sexual and romantic relationships. And I mean, the same goes for bestiality and incest as well. There's no innate biological predisposition to, be attracted to animals or to, to be attracted to, we were talking about polygamy, bestiality, and incest. To be attracted to animals or to be attracted to members of your own family. So there you go. I mean, I think that's one of the critical distinctions between homosexuality and polygamy, bestiality, and incest. Take that out of the equation and it becomes somewhat harder, at least, I think actually substantially harder, to distinguish homosexuality from those other more controversial forms of sexuality that most people still agree should not be recognized or even permitted by government. So, those are the reasons why I think it actually matters that homosexuality is not a choice. I think a lot of the folks who claim that it doesn't matter whether it's a choice or not are being a bit flippant and cavalier, and they're not necessarily giving the issue enough in-depth thought. And part of the reason for that is they're not taking into account that the marriage equality issue is about how the government treats people. It's about what the government gives people or doesn't give them, and the basis on which it gives them those things or does not give them. It's not about personal liberty and personal choice. It's tempting to cast and frame the issue in those terms, but I don't think it's correct. So that's my take on this issue. I could go on for hours about this, and I just might if you guys comment on this particular video, but we'll leave that for another day. You know the drill. Fire away. Look forward to hearing from you. See you later.